Okay, let's dive right into something that, frankly, when I first looked at the source material, it felt almost unbelievable. Just imagine this for a second. A man gets legal protection from a U.S. court. An order saying specifically, don't deport him to this one country because he's got a credible fear for his life there. But then somehow the government sends him exactly there, to that country.
Yeah.
And it gets even more intense. He ends up being held in a prison that some sources describe as, notorious, a supermax facility. Some even make these chilling comparisons to places designed for, like, indefinite detention without charges.
Right.
Then, fast forward, there's this huge legal fight, goes all the way to the Supreme Court to force his return, and he finally lands back on U.S. soil, only to be immediately arrested with major federal criminal charges.
It is, it's definitely a sequence of events that raises some pretty fundamental questions about law, about process, government accountability. This whole complex, very controversial case centers on an immigrant from El Salvador, Kilmar Abrego Garcia.
And that's really the heart of our deep dive today. We've gone through a lot of material for you. Court documents, official press releases from government agencies, detailed news reports mapping out the timeline, legal analysis from experts, even articles reflecting, the public discussion around it.
Yeah, and our goal here is really to try and cut through all the different narratives swirling around. We want to pull out the core information, understand the key legal ideas being debated, and really get a handle on why this particular case has become such a flashpoint. It's drawn attention from, lawmakers, legal minds, advocates.
Right. Let's unpack this then. Where do we even start with Mr. Garcia's story?
Well, the sources tell us he's an immigrant from El Salvador. He came into the U.S. illegally, seems like as a teenager, back in 2011. And he settled in Maryland. Over the next decade or so, he, reportedly built a life there.
Yeah, the material mentions he was working as a sheet metal apprentice, living with his family, and importantly has U.S. citizen children. That personal context comes up a lot in the reports. Seems crucial for understanding the kind of human side of what happened later.
And then there was a really significant legal moment in 2019. An immigration judge looked at his case and granted him something called withholding of removal.
Okay.
Now, that's not quite the same as asylum, which can eventually lead to permanent residency, but it's still a vital form of protection. It legally stops his deportation specifically to El Salvador.
And that stop, that prohibition, was based on a judge finding he had a credible fear of persecution from gangs if he went back.
Exactly. It was a humanitarian protection grounded in the court's assessment of real danger to him there.
So the court basically said, okay, he might be removable from the U.S. generally, but he absolutely cannot be sent back to El Salvador because of that specific threat.
Precisely. Legally barred from being sent there.
Okay, now let's jump forward a bit. 2022. Some sources mention a traffic stop in Tennessee. Right. He was driving some other people who didn't have ID, and there was, suspicion of human trafficking at the time.
Yeah, that's mentioned. But it's important, as the sources note, he wasn't actually charged with anything then, not from that specific incident.
Okay, so no charges then. But it seems like that incident pops up later in some of the government's material about him.
It does seem to resurface later, yes.
Which makes what happened next just so jarring. Because it seems to fly directly in the face of that 2019 court order we just talked about,
right.
March 2025. Reports say he gets arrested by ICE Immigration and Customs Enforcement. And despite that really clear judge's order forbidding deportation to El Salvador, sources confirm he was deported there anyway. Apparently part of a larger group, nearly 230 people sent there around the same time.
And the place he was held when he got there is particularly noteworthy, according to the sources. He was sent to the CECOT prison.
CECOT, yeah, I saw that name.
It's described again and again in the material as a notorious supermax prison, or the terrorism confinement center. The conditions there, the nature of detention, that's a major point of concern raised in the sources.
Yeah, sources describe it as a place where many people are held without formal charges, often under a state of emergency. And they quote Salvadoran government officials saying detainees will never leave. Some analyses we looked at even draw comparisons between the indefinite detention without due process at CECOT and, historical definitions of concentration camps. That's incredibly strong language.
It really underscores the seriousness of the situation from the viewpoint of those challenging the deportation and the government's initial reason for sending him there, despite the court order.
What did they say?
According to court documents cited in the material, government lawyers basically conceded it was an administrative error, or maybe a clerical error.
An error. Wow. An error with huge consequences for his family. You see these quotes from his wife, Jennifer Vasquez Sura, just expressing the devastation. She says, "In the blink of an eye, our 3 children lost their father. Our entire family is broken by what, in Icy's words, was an error."
Yeah.
And the president of the SMART union, where he was an apprentice, is quoted saying something like, "It's just not enough to admit you made a mistake. You need to fix it."
And fixing it, well, that became the immediate focus for his legal team and his advocate.
Absolutely. A legal challenge was filed right away. The argument was pretty clear. The deportation was a blatant violation of that standing court order, a denial of his due process rights.
And the courts largely seemed to agree with that argument. A federal judge ordered the government to facilitate his return to the U.S.
Not just a federal judge, right? Didn't this go higher?
It did. That order was affirmed by the Supreme Court, a unanimous ruling upholding the lower court's decision. They required the administration to facilitate his return.
It's a unanimous Supreme Court ruling. Yet what's really striking, according to some sources, is that even with these clear court mandates, some administration officials reportedly seemed resistant. One source quotes Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem saying something like, "There is no scenario where Abrego Garcia will be in the United States again."
Yeah, that reported stance, seemingly contradicting a unanimous Supreme Court decision, definitely drew criticism from lawmakers and rights groups, as you would expect. It's noted in the material.
And there's another layer here, right? The financial one.
Yes, sources indicate the U.S. government was reportedly paying El Salvador, paying them to hold Abrego Garcia and other deportees.
Which, as some analyses point out, kind of makes claims about not being able to get him back seem, well, questionable, if there was already a financial deal for his detention over there.
It raises questions, definitely.
Yeah.
Eventually, though, after months in El Salvador, after all the court battles, he was returned to the U.S. But this is where the story takes another really sharp turn, according to the sources.
Yeah, because he doesn't just get sent home. The moment he's back, he's taken into custody again to face a newly unsealed federal grand jury indictment from Tennessee.
And these are very serious charges. The indictment, as reported, includes 2 counts: conspiracy to transport aliens and unlawful transportation of undocumented aliens.
The main allegation, detailed in the indictment and talked about across the sources, is that he was involved in this long-running conspiracy, like 9 years, transporting thousands of undocumented migrants, adults and kids, from Texas to other parts of the U.S.
Attorney General Pam Bondi held a press conference about it. Sources quote her calling the indictment and his arrest American justice. She said, "Abrego Garcia has landed in the United States to face justice."
And the details in the indictment, or at least described in the sources, they mention things like 6 unnamed co-conspirators using cell phones, social media, making up cover stories.
Right, like saying people were traveling for construction work, that kind of thing.
Collecting payments from the migrants, moving money around to hide where it came from. And some sources also mention allegations from the indictment about transporting illegally bought firearms for resale in Maryland.
Yeah, those details are in there. Now, here's something that some legal analyses in our sources highlight as pretty critical regarding that press conference by Attorney General Bondi. Reports indicate she mentioned some allegations that were not actually in the formal indictment document itself. Things like a potential role in a murder or soliciting inappropriate pictures from a minor.
Ah, okay, that's a really important distinction, isn't it? As the sources point out, the indictment is the formal list of charges someone has to defend against in court.
Yeah.
These other things mentioned publicly, like murder or soliciting pictures, they might be things the government hopes to use as evidence later, or maybe claims they haven't formally charged yet, but they aren't the actual charges he's facing from that indictment.
Exactly.
And highlighting uncharged allegations in a big public announcement like that, well, it's a tactic that draws debate, raises questions about intent, according to some of the analyses we read.
And this stark contrast, the government's earlier actions versus these very serious charges now filed against him, that's really the core conflict that the sources illuminate in this whole case.
Yeah, it's like 2 competing narratives.
Yeah.
On one side, you have the government's repeated claims, pushed in various sources, that he's a dangerous guy, a violent criminal, specifically an MS-13 gang member.
And the material points to a few things they base this on. There was a 2019 arrest where law enforcement reportedly cited his clothes, a Chicago Bulls hat, a hoodie with some symbol they called indicative of Hispanic gang culture. They also mentioned a confidential informant who supposedly identified him as an active MS-13 member, and that he was apparently with known gang members at the time of that arrest.
And the new indictment itself, the one just unsealed, claims that evidence at trial will show his longstanding membership and association with MS-13, and that this alleged link helped facilitate the smuggling.
Right. Sources also note that back in 2019, a different immigration judge had initially decided not to release him on bond, specifically because of suspected gang ties. And that decision was upheld on appeal just for the bond issue. So these details are consistently brought up by the government, and some commentators in the sources use them to paint him as a definite threat.
Okay, but then you have this really strong counter-narrative coming from his legal team, advocates, other sources, and it's all focused on due process. They strongly deny any gang ties. They state flat out he has no criminal history in the U.S. or El Salvador, never charged, never convicted of gang stuff.
And they point to what they see as a critical piece of evidence from the court record itself. Remember that other 2019 immigration judge? The one who actually granted the withholding of removal.
Yeah.
Well, according to the sources, that judge did not find the government's gang allegations convincing enough to block the protection from deportation to El Salvador.
Oh, okay. That seems significant.
It's highlighted as very significant because the judge who reviewed the evidence in the most relevant hearing, the one deciding if he could be sent back to El Salvador, didn't think the gang evidence was strong enough to deny him that protection.
Yeah, and sources raise questions about the reliability of that evidence, too. Like, how reliable is the confidential informant? Does wearing a bull's hat really mean you're in a gang?
Right.
And they point out, why didn't the government push the gang argument harder back in that crucial 2019 hearing? If proving gang affiliation would have stopped the withholding order then, why wasn't it the main focus?
Which brings the timing of this new indictment into really sharp focus. Critics, as reported everywhere, argue that bringing these huge charges now, right after being forced by the courts, including the Supreme Court, to bring him back. While it looks highly suspicious to them, some sources flat out call it an abuse of power, or say the government is playing games just to save face, trying to prove he is a bad guy after they were compelled to return him.
His attorney had that quote that really drives it home. Due process means the chance to defend yourself before you're punished, not after.
And look, regardless of whether the smuggling charges are true or the gang allegations are true, and those are issues that presumably will be fought out in court now, the core argument from advocates, as presented in the sources, is that this case is fundamentally about the government's actions. Did they violate his due process rights by deporting him against a court order, by sending him to a place like CCOT, before dealing with any criminal allegations through the proper legal channels here in the U.S.?
Yeah, Senator Chris Van Hollen is quoted making that exact point very clearly. This is not about the man, it's about his constitutional rights and the rights of all.
Which brings us right to that key principle underpinning so much of this debate in the sources, due process. What does that actually mean, for non-citizens in the U.S.?
Well, the sources consistently say that due process does apply to non-citizens here, including when they're in removal proceedings.
Right.
They point to the Fifth Amendment of the Constitution. It guarantees that no person, and that includes aliens, can be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law.
It's presented as this fundamental value, right? That everyone physically here in America gets a fair legal process. In deportation cases, sources explain it means getting notice, having a chance to be heard, a process appropriate to the nature of the case. It might not always look like a full criminal trial, but it has to be fair.
And a really critical safeguard that comes up repeatedly is the right to habeas corpus. Sources describe it as the right to challenge the legality of your detention in front of a judge. It's like a fundamental check on government power, making sure basic truths are checked when someone's locked up or about to be removed, like, is this the right person? Is there a court order being ignored?
Right. And while due process in immigration can get complicated, especially when there's a final order of removal, sources emphasize that when there's a standing court order, like the withholding of removal Abrego Garcia had, due process demands the government respect that order. They have to use the proper legal channels before taking action that directly violates it, like deporting him to the very country the order prohibited.
It is worth noting, though, as some sources include, that you do hear differing views out there. Some individuals, some commentators suggest maybe due process rights for illegal aliens should be more limited or different than for citizens.
Sure, those views are mentioned, but the legal analysis presented in the sources we reviewed, and frankly the actions of the courts in this case, seem to firmly ground the discussion in the application of due process rights to non-citizens, particularly that right to challenge detention and make sure existing court orders saying where someone cannot be sent are actually followed.
Ultimately, this whole case is highlighted again and again in the sources. It connects to some much bigger issues, doesn't it?
Absolutely. It's frequently brought up as an example of potential weaknesses, potential flaws within the U.S. immigration system and its enforcement practices. There are concerns raised about tactics like targeting individuals during routine check-in appointments, for instance.
It also represents a very public clash, really, between the executive branch's actions and what the judiciary ordered, with the administration reportedly, pushing back against court directives.
And significantly, sources raise the concern that this might not be just a one-off incident. They highlight the situations of other individuals who might have been deported under, let's say, questionable circumstances, maybe to harsh places like CCOT, whose cases just haven't gotten the same level of public attention.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, the case of Kilmar Abrego Garcia leaves us with this really striking contrast. On one hand, you've got these incredibly serious federal charges now against him, alleging extensive involvement in human smuggling over many, many years.
And on the other hand, you have these profound concerns raised by a really wide array of sources about the government's conduct. His deportation directly against a clear court order, his detention in that notoriously harsh foreign prison, CECOT, and of course, the timing of these charges being brought the second he stepped back onto U.S. soil under court mandate.
This case really forces us, I think, to confront some fundamental questions about legal rights, about the limits of government authority, and how we treat individuals within our justice system, regardless of their immigration status or how serious the accusations against them might be.
Yeah. As you, the listener, sort of process the facts and the arguments presented in the sources we've discussed today, think about that principle of due process. It's meant to be this cornerstone protection, right, for everyone under the law, ensuring a fair process before someone's life or liberty can be taken away. What does this really complex situation maybe reveal about the challenges and maybe the necessity of consistently upholding that principle, especially in these really contentious cases involving immigration and national security claims?